This is Jaguar chapter 17, and we're starting on page 178. But I want to back up and just read you the last sentence of chapter 16, okay? It says, excuse me, I heard them talking into the night. That's Flana and Doc, guys. I hope that Flana would talk some sense into him. She hadn't. The next morning, Doc was up at his usual time, stuffing his pack with gear. He didn't look healthy. Doc, are you feeling all right? I'm fine, he said, and tried to smile. If the weather isn't right, don't go up. Flana's right, I said. You should wait until you're stronger. Jake, I have to do this. I promise. I'll take it easy out there. Don't worry about me. Right. An idea occurred to me. Why don't you let me go with you? I could carry some of your gear, lighten your load. You need to stay here and keep track of the Jaguars. I'm concerned that Beth isn't near her cubs. Something isn't right. What will you do if she stays away from them? Probably nothing. Then why don't you let me go with you? Jake, your job is to fly the Morpho. I'll be fine. He gave me a half-hearted hug and slipped his pack over his shoulders. A few moments later, he and Raoul disappeared behind a veil of green vegetation. Flana came out of the tent after he had left. Your father is the most pig-headed man I've ever known. I laughed. What's so funny? She snapped. You sound exactly like someone else I used to know. I don't know how many times I had heard my mom say the same exact thing with exactly the same level of exasperation. She took a breath. He's a manic, but you gotta love him. That's the worst part. He's been running a fever for the past week. He thinks he can work his way through it. She shook her head. Oh well, we tried. Are you ready to learn something about climbing trees? Absolutely. Great. When you come back from your morning flight, I'll show you my web. What web? You'll see. Wild Bill and Tall were in the same areas I had found them in the day before. Beth was another story. I circled around and around trying to pick up her signal, with no luck. I began to wonder if her collar had malfunctioned. I flew around some more, then started to get low on gas. I continued to monitor her frequency as I flew back towards the lake. About halfway there, I picked up a faint signal. It grew louder the closer I got to the lake, and still louder as I passed over the lake. What was she up to? I finally flew over top of her several miles west of the lake. At this rate, she would be out of the Morpho's range in a few days. I hoped she would settle down. By the time I landed, I was nearly on empty. I reminded myself to be more careful in the future. Doc wouldn't be very happy if I had to tell him that I lost the Morpho because I ran out of gas. To say nothing about what Buzz would say when we finally saw him again. Silver was standing on the shore. He must have just gotten back from one of his strolls. He looked worn out, but he helped me put the Morpho away. So you let the Jaguars go? Yesterday, and Beth is in a traveling mode, I told him where she was. What's it like on that side of the lake? What do you mean? I don't know, he said. Do you usually see any land formations, other lakes, things like that? I shook my head. Just green canopy. Are you looking for something in particular? Nah, I'm just interested in the geography of this place. If you're over there again, keep your eyes open and let me know if you see anything. Sure. I told him that Doc and Raoul had taken off for a few days. He seemed too tired to care one way or the other. He got into the Zodiac and headed out to the Tito. Before I visited Flana, I went up to the rock to make sure Raoul had picked up the mechanical pencil. I didn't want it to rust while he was away. It was gone. I took the trail to Flana's tree-top kingdom. In the few areas where the sunlight found its way through the thick canopy were the patches of dense tropical growth, but very little sunlight made it to the ground. Most of the light was blocked 100 feet above, where the lowest tree branches hung. I came across a river of red flower petals crossing the trail in front of me. A 2-inch wide column of leaf-cutting ants were carrying petals to their underground nest. I had read that their nests were gigantic, holding up to 5 million workers. The entrances to the same nest can be separated by as much as 50 yards. The ants don't eat the leaves or petals. They use them to cultivate subterranean fungus gardens. I stepped over to the column and continued on. The huge tree trunks I passed were covered with moss and plants. Aerial roots twisted around each other and dangled to the ground. When I got to the site, I didn't see Flana. I put my head all the way back and tried to find her in the dark canopy, but I couldn't spot her. I called out. "I'll be there in a second," Flana called back. A few moments later, she dropped to the ground on the end of a rope. She had on a yellow hard hat, gloves, a pair of protective goggles hanging around her neck, and a machete hanging from her belt around her waist. It reminded me of an old photo I'd seen of Tall in his steelworking outfit, minus the machete. Flana gave me about an hour of climbing instructions before she let me put the harness on. "How do you get the first rope up in the tree?" I asked. "If there are good vines around the trunk, I free climb. If not, I use a bow and arrow." She brought out a compound bow and a quiver of arrows. I don't use the points, of course. She took an arrow, removed the point, and put on a different attachment. She tied some heavy fishing line to the attachment, then strung the bow. Leaning back, she took aim and sent the arrow up into the canopy. It went over the top of a branch and got tangled. Now for the hard part. She pulled on the line until the shaft was free, then carefully fed more line and lowered the arrow an inch at a time until it was back on the ground. All you do is tie a rope onto the fishing line and pull it over the top of the branch. Of course, it always gets hung up. It took me over 4 hours to get the first rope set. After that, it usually goes pretty smoothly. Are you ready? I guess so. She gave me a hard hat, gloves, and goggles. You won't need the goggles until we get into the canopy. A lot of people don't use them, but I don't like worrying about my eyes when I'm up there. I started to pull myself up the rope. She had a special clamping device that held you in place while you got your next hand hold. It was a lot harder than I expected. I had to pause every few feet to catch my breath. Flana paused along with me, but it was clear she didn't need to. 100 feet or so, there was nothing to see but the vine-covered trunk. This changed dramatically when we passed through the lower story of the canopy. It was a different world, a world that couldn't be seen from below or from up above, flying the Morpho. The canopy was alive with plants and animals, spiders, scorpions, centipedes, lizards, frogs, snakes, and little colorful birds. We stopped to look at the 3-toed sloth hanging upside down. Its long hair was tinted green and blended perfectly with the moss-covered branch it clung to. I saw a gigantic spider web with several large shapes wrapped in silk. "Bats and birds," Flana said. "What kind of spider eats bats and birds?" I thought. "How big is it?" "You don't want to know." There were dozens of beautifully colored orchids and other plants I couldn't identify. Most of these plants are different types of lynches and bromeliads. They are air plants, Flana said. There's no soil up here. They get their nutrients from small particles of dust dissolved in rain. She went on to explain that some types of bromeliads have leaves that overlap, forming bowls that store water, like this one. She carefully parted the leaves of a large plant. At the base was a little pool of water, and sitting in the middle of the pool was a bright red frog, no bigger than my thumb. Poison arrow frog. It's called that because it secretes a toxin that some tribes distill and put on the end of darts and arrows. The frog's bright color warns potential predators that they're in for a surprise if they try to make a snack out of it. A little further on, I saw a fierce-looking insect, about an inch long, covered in what looked like body armor. It's called a paraponaria ant. It's also known as a bullet ant because that's what it feels like when it stings you. It was bigger than any ant I'd ever seen. It looked like a little tank. "Listen," Flana said. She broke off a long twig and poked it at the ant. It spun around with its large jaws wide open and let out a threatening screech. The noise was exactly what Scarlet would sound like if she were only an inch long. We finally reached the branch that the ropes were tied to. "We'll rest here." The branch was 3 feet around and covered with a virtual garden of large-leafed plants, orchids, bromeliads, and ants. As soon as I sat down, the ants started snapping at me. I scooted farther down the branch to get out of their way and came to a carpet of thick moss that continued up the trunk of the tree. After checking to make sure there wasn't anything hiding in it that would bite me, I leaned back. It was as comfortable as an easy chair. I looked up. About 30 feet above me were several ropes leading off in different directions. "That's my web," Flana said. "That's how I get around from tree to tree." Now that I was sitting, I could feel the tree swaying back and forth. It was a little unnerving. "You'll get used to the motion in a minute," Flana said. "It's like being on the deck of a boat. You just have to learn to move with it." "As long as you don't fall out," I said. "Yeah, that can hurt." "What kind of tree is this?" "Brazil nut. Are you hungry?" Without waiting for an answer, Flana stood up on her toes as casually as if she were standing on a city sidewalk. She reached out to the next branch and pulled off a pod about the size of a soccer ball. She set it down in front of me and sliced it open with one swing from her machete. Inside were 20 or 30 of the most delicious Brazilian nuts I'd ever tasted. There was a sudden motion above us, and Scarlet landed on the branch. Flana didn't act surprised. She always seems to show up when I have food. "I thought Scarlet hated you." "Not anymore." She gave Scarlet a Brazil nut. "She drops by every day. Her friends are still a little shy." She pointed up. The flock was about 50 feet above us. Flana explained that despite the heavy rainfall in the Amazon basin, 3/4 of the yearly precipitation comes from the moisture released into the air by the plants. If enough trees are removed, the precipitation cycle will be broken, and the results will be extended dry periods that will kill the canopy and the animals that live here. I realized that jaguars were only a small part of why the rainforest needed to be preserved. The important part was here in the canopy, where Flana said 3/4 of the forest animals lived, many of them never touching the ground. I also realized that Flana was as committed to her work in the treetops as Doc was to his work on the ground. "Now that I have you captive," Flana said, "perhaps we should talk about your manic father and me." I like Flana, but I didn't know if I was ready to talk about this with her. "If you're uncomfortable, we don't have to." "No," I said, "go ahead." But it did seem a little odd sitting up in a tree talking about my father with his girlfriend. "I guess one thing you should know is that if you and he go back to Poughkeepsie, I would like to go with you," Flana said. "What about your work down here?" It might be nice to go back to the States for a while. "Sounds like you and Doc have talked about this." "A little," she said. "He's determined to go back so you can go to school." This was bad news. I thought that he would change his mind once he got into the project. "I don't know what the big deal is," I said. "You both have PhDs. Why can't you teach me what I need to know?" Flana laughed. I used the same argument on him. And he said no. Pig-headed. Exactly. But don't give up hope. If we both keep working on him, maybe we can get him to change his mind. "That would be a first," I said. "But I'm glad to know you're on my side." Flana smiled. "Are you ready to go higher?"